Perhaps with time, you might come to like me.
From big screen blockbusters
I trusted you.
to gripping TV dramas,
The jury is everything.
He beat the cancer. He told the world his body was finally clear. And 3 months later, he was gone, in the middle of the biggest fight of his life. This is the story nobody wrapped up in a neat little obituary, because it isn't over, and Sam Neill never got to see how it ends. On Monday, the 13th of July, 2026, a short statement appeared on Sam Neill's Instagram page. It came from his family, and it landed like a punch nobody saw coming. They wrote that Sam had passed surrounded by family, with the same quiet dignity he'd carried his whole life, in Sydney, at St. Vincent's Private Hospital. Then came the line that made the whole thing feel impossible. They called the loss sudden and unexpected, but said it was blessed by one strange comfort: Sam had remained cancer-free. He was 78 years old, and just weeks earlier, he had told the world he'd won. Within hours, the tributes started pouring in from 2 countries at once. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, called him one of the greats, a man who had carried New Zealand stories to the world for more than 50 years, back to a time when the country barely had a film industry to speak of. Across the Tasman, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described him as wry, dry, thoughtful, a man who fought illness with the same humour and grit he brought to every role. Fellow actors lined up to say goodbye. Carl Urban called him a national treasure and a beautiful man. Laura Dern, who spent decades of friendship with him since Jurassic Park, called him a true and noble gentleman. Toni Collette said simply that she loved him. Over and over, in statement after statement, people reached for the exact same word to describe him: decency. But here's the part that got buried under all those tributes, the part that turns this from a sad celebrity headline into something much bigger. Sam Neill didn't spend his final year coasting on a career full of applause. He spent it standing in front of bulldozers, fighting a foreign mining company over a mountain range in his own backyard, getting mocked by a sitting government minister, and absorbing a wave of online abuse so ugly that he described it, in his own words, as shocking and disturbing, including threats of physical violence. To understand why his death feels like an unfinished sentence, you have to go back to the miracle that arrived just months before it. Back in 2022, while Sam was traveling to promote the newest Jurassic World film, he noticed his neck glands had swollen and wouldn't settle down. The diagnosis that followed was brutal: a rare and aggressive blood cancer called angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, already at stage 3 by the time doctors caught it. He kept it private at first. When the initial round of chemotherapy didn't hold the disease back, doctors moved him onto other treatments, and for a long stretch it genuinely looked like he was running out of time. Sam, being Sam, refused to let the fear swallow him whole. He sat down and wrote a memoir, Did I Ever Tell You This?, and later said the writing itself was what kept him going, something to occupy his hands and his mind while his body was quietly losing ground. When he went public with the diagnosis in early 2023, he did it with almost no self-pity at all, saying he wasn't particularly afraid of dying, just annoyed that there were still things he wanted to do. Then came the turn nobody expected. Sam enrolled in a clinical trial in Australia for CAR T-cell therapy, a treatment that takes a patient's own immune cells, re-engineers them, and sends them back into the body to hunt the cancer down. In late April of 2026, he shared the news that felt like a door swinging open. A scan had come back completely clear. No cancer left anywhere in his body. He called it extraordinary, but he was quick to correct anyone who called it a miracle. He insisted it was science doing exactly what science is supposed to do, and he threw himself into becoming an advocate for getting that same therapy to more people across Australia and New Zealand. For a family that had spent years bracing for the worst, this was supposed to be the happy ending. Instead of using that borrowed time to rest, Sam picked a fight. And the fight he picked was over a mountain range in central Otago, on New Zealand's South Island, where his own family roots run more than 150 years deep. An Australian company called Santana Minerals had been drilling along a ridgeline in the Dunstan Mountains, in a stretch of country so striking that local planning documents themselves describe it as an outstanding natural landscape. In 2021, the company announced it had struck the biggest gold discovery New Zealand had seen in 4 decades, an estimated 1.2 million ounces, with the project's value later climbing into the billions of dollars as gold prices kept rising. They named the project Bendigo Offer, and the scale of what they were proposing is what pulled Sam Neill into the fight in the first place. This was never going to be a handful of prospectors with pans in a river. The plan involves a series of open pits carved directly into the hills, with the largest stretching close to 1 kilometer long. It calls for an industrial processing plant using cyanide to strip gold from the rock, and for a permanent tailings dam, essentially a massive holding pond for toxic waste, sitting in the valley indefinitely. Experts raised concerns about naturally occurring arsenic being released from rock that had sat undisturbed for millions of years, and about that waste sitting near the headwaters of a major river system, in a region known for significant earthquake activity. New Zealand's environmental watchdog said plainly that if those risks couldn't be properly managed, the application should be turned down. Sam wanted one thing understood clearly, and he repeated it constantly. He wasn't against mining as a concept. He was against this mine, in this place, given what it would cost. He described the region as one of the most beautiful and strange, remote places in the world, and warned that a project of this size could scar it permanently, threatening not just the landscape but the wine, tourism and farming industries that had sustained central Otago for generations, a district that, without any mine at all, already had the lowest unemployment rate in the entire country. He put his name and his face behind a short documentary filmed in those very mountains, calling on people to be good ancestors, to leave the place better than they found it, and describing the mine, in blunt terms, as a disaster the region simply couldn't afford. The video spread fast, and that's exactly when things turned ugly. For most of his life, Sam Neill had been one of the most unbothered famous people in his corner of the world. He'd walk into his local town of Clyde, sit down with a coffee, and nobody would trouble him. He never wanted a bodyguard or an entourage, and he treasured that ordinary freedom more than any red carpet he'd ever walked. None of that prepared him for what came flooding back once he spoke out against the mine. In a video statement, he admitted he stood by everything he'd said and was glad he'd said it, but he didn't pretend the fallout hadn't shaken him. He described the volume of personal abuse that came in online as frankly very shocking and disturbing, and said some of it crossed into threats of physical violence. He called some of the mine's supporters loose cannons, people who had lost all sense of proportion over a pile of gold. And it wasn't only him. Members of Sustainable Taras, the small local community group he'd joined forces with, ordinary farmers and neighbors, also reported threats serious enough to involve police. The blow that seemed to sting the most, though, didn't come from an anonymous account. It came from a man with a government title. Shane Jones, New Zealand's Resources Minister, had made himself the face of the country's push toward faster mining approvals, borrowing the old drill, baby, drill line for his own purposes. When Sam started speaking out against Bendigo offer, Jones didn't treat him like a respected elder statesman of New Zealand film with every right to an opinion. He treated him like an opponent to be publicly cut down. Jones told reporters that Neill didn't own the landscape, that he may have starred in Jurassic Park but he was wrong, and anti-Kiwi, to suggest the mine would bring some kind of Jurassic-sized disaster. He argued a famous actor shouldn't get to run those arguments unchallenged just because his face was known worldwide, at one point telling Neill to stick to his knitting. He also compared the scale of the mining footprint to a beauty spot on a woman's face, a comparison the head of Sustainable Taras called out directly as tone-deaf and sexist. Sam didn't back down, and he never let an insult go unanswered in his life. He said he didn't know much about Shane Jones, but one thing was obvious. The man was a bully and a hypocrite, pointing out that Jones himself had once given an anti-mining speech years earlier, which Jones brushed off as the words of his younger, more idealistic self. Neill flipped the anti-Kiwi line right back on him, suggesting that such devotion to a foreign mining company sounded fairly anti-Kiwi in itself, and at another point he described Jones as behaving like a mini-Trump wannabe, a headline that made the rounds across New Zealand media. He said, plainly, that he'd never had much patience for bullies. The back and forth escalated enough that reports at the time suggested Jones's own party leader, Winston Peters, eventually had to step in and tell him to drop it. All of this played out against the backdrop of a fast-track approvals law that had already triggered enormous public anger nationwide, drawing tens of thousands of formal submissions and pulling large crowds into the streets of Auckland in protest. None of this came out of nowhere for Sam. He'd spent more than 30 years with his hands in that soil long before he ever stood in front of a camera defending it. In 1993, the same year he became known worldwide as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, he planted his first vines in central Otago and started a small organic vineyard called Two Paddocks, named after a friend's neighboring plot. Over the decades it grew into a respected wine label, producing Pinot Noir that earned real praise from critics, and Sam used to joke, only half joking, that he cared more about reviews of his wine than reviews of his films. This was the life he actually wanted, a world away from Hollywood's noise. He was famously modest about his fame, filling his farm with animals named after famous friends, so that a chicken might carry the name of one screen legend and a cow the name of another. He was a father of 4 and grandfather many times over, and by every account, his home life was warm, busy, and gloriously normal. When Sam looked at those mountains, he wasn't looking at scenery. He was looking at 150 years of family history, and at whatever he still hoped to hand down to the people who came after him. That's why this fight was never really about politics for him. It came from something he said plainly more than once, that one of our basic responsibilities in this life is to leave the place better than we found it. That belief is exactly what a permanent lake of toxic waste sitting above a major river system would break in the most direct way imaginable. When the obituaries went out around the world, something unusual happened. They didn't just talk about the dinosaurs and the awards and the 50-year career. Again and again, they mentioned the mine, the fight, the threats, the minister, as though the world understood this last chapter was every bit as much a part of who Sam Neill was as any role he ever played. Even people connected to the mine supporters paused to acknowledge him, with one pro-project group offering condolences and calling him one of Central Otago's most passionate ambassadors, a striking thing to hear given how personal the fight had gotten. Sam's friend and longtime collaborator, director Roger Donaldson, said afterward that Neill had genuinely been upset by the aggression from critics, Shane Jones included, and suggested it may well have taken a toll on him in his final months. Here's the detail that makes this story impossible to file away neatly. On the day Sam Neill died, the mine had not been approved, and it had not been rejected either. The decision was still sitting with an expert panel, with a ruling expected on the 29th of October, 2026, just about a week before a national election. There's also a live legal question hanging over the whole process, with several local Maori authorities raising concerns that the company's early consultation didn't actually meet the bar of genuine consultation, a challenge that could still reshape the entire outcome. In plain terms, the exact fight Sam poured his final months into is still completely undecided. Science gave Sam Neill his life back in the spring of 2026, and for a moment, everyone let themselves believe the worst was truly behind him. He took that unexpected gift of extra time and, instead of spending it quietly at home with a glass of his own Pinot Noir, he spent it standing in front of bulldozers, absorbing the abuse, trading blows with a government minister, and asking his own country to protect a place that couldn't protect itself. He talked, more than once, about wanting to be a good ancestor. Then, without warning, he was gone, and the fight he cared about most was suddenly missing its loudest and clearest voice.